I think I'm on. I think I'm
Okay.
wired. Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. What I'm going to be speaking about, which is kind of focused on this Paris meeting that just happened, is something that it's been in the news, and people knew that there was this big meeting in Paris going on, and people know that there was a lot of applause at the end, and agreement was reached, but it's kind of confusing, I think, for a lot of people to really know what happened and what it was about. And so I'm going to say a little bit about that and what it means as far as trying to solve this climate problem that we're dealing with. And in particular, I'm going to talk about what fairness, what equity has to do with it all. So I'm going to start, just because all such presentations should start, with at least one slide about climate change, just to make the point that it's continuing and it hasn't somehow disappeared. This is a chart that just came out of average February temperatures. And what you see is that they've been kind of trending upward for the last 20 years. And then this past February we just came out of, temperatures just spiked. And normally climate scientists, the people who are looking at this data, say a month, there's all kinds of jitter and things go up and things go down. Don't pay too much attention to 1 month's average temperature. This time they didn't say that. This time they said, whoa, what's going on there? And we know that climate change is getting worse, and it's getting somewhat precipitously worse. This is an El Nino year, which just exacerbates that. But what it means is that the heat in the ocean is being released to the atmosphere a little bit more than usual. The heat in the ocean is where most of the heat, about 99% of the heat that we've added to the Earth's system has gone. Only about 1% of the heat that we've added to the Earth actually is in the atmosphere. If all that heat were released, it would increase temperatures by 100 degrees Celsius. Now, that's not what happened. That's not even close to what happened. But what this shows is that we really are messing with the climate system. We're messing with the climate system to the extent that we aren't really very good at understanding how rapidly things can change. This is only one of the many markers of what's happening. There's a drought happening in the Eastern Mediterranean that's worse than any drought in the last 900 years. The sea ice in the Arctic declined to a lower point than it has before this past couple of months. So there are a whole set of different markers that just tell us unequivocally that, yes, climate change continues. So that's why there was a meeting in Paris. This is the most recent annual meeting of all of the parties to the Climate Treaty, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change that was first signed in 1992. Each year there's been a negotiation to kind of progress it further and further and further. And it was a big meeting. It was a very big meeting, and that's why there was so much media. It was the largest gathering of heads of state, more than 150 ever, not just a climate meeting, not just some UN sponsor, but ever. There were about 200 parties to the climate treaty. About 150 heads of states were there. And it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that this meeting saved environmental multilateralism. There was a real breakdown in Copenhagen. Parties stormed out in acrimony. There was fear that this next big attempt, 5 years later, to try and really forge ahead and create a new agreement could end the same way. A lot of work was done, background work, sort of groundwork to try and avoid that, and it was avoided. An agreement was forged. Multilateralism in the climate world was saved. In a sense, it was saved at a cost, because it's kind of a different kind of multilateralism. This agreement, the Paris Agreement, is more bottom-up than perhaps any other environmental agreement. And what that means is that countries basically have come forward over the process of the previous years deciding what they felt like contributing to this big effort, their own nationally determined contributions, and put that on the table in Paris. And the Paris Agreement, the nuts and bolts of it, the backbone of the Paris Agreement, is this set of national pledges. All the countries came forward saying, this is what we're willing to do to try and help solve the climate problem. This is our pledge. This is our commitment. Most of them were they were sort of an emissions target for the year 2030. This is what we'll get our emissions down to in 2030. And that really is the flesh of the Paris Agreement. And so how effective Paris was really depends on what these pledges actually add up to. How close do they come to saving the climate? And a lot of interest, of course, is in that question. There were another thing I want to say about Paris is, in the Paris Agreement, they more explicitly than ever before really set a hard target for what they think saving the climate means. It means holding the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. So hopefully we can even do better than that and keep warming below 1.5 degrees. And I should say, when you look outside, you might wonder, 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees, what's the big deal when temperatures over the course of today are rising 20 degrees? Why does it even, why does trying to keep climate change to such, tiny little margins, why does it even matter? Well, the 20-degree swing we're seeing today, that's in one place on one day. And heat is sloshing all over the world all the time. Upper atmosphere to lower atmosphere, as we saw, from the oceans to the air, night, day. But a 1.5 or 2 degree rise, averaged over the whole surface of the planet, is actually a lot. If we don't do anything, it would be maybe 4 or 5 degrees temperature rise by the end of the century. 4 or 5 degrees temperature rise is the amount of warming that has occurred since the Earth was in the depths of the last ice age. 4 or 5 degrees temperature rise is enough to radically transform the surface of the Earth. Standing here 15,000 years ago, you would have been under a mile of ice. So avoiding 4 or 5 degrees temperature rise is really important. Allowing 2 degrees temperature rise is sort of saying, okay, we think we can handle half the amount of temperature rise that corresponds to coming out of the depths of an ice age. There's actually not a huge amount of evidence that we can. That's a real article of faith that we can handle 2 degrees temperature rise. But at this point, that's what countries are thinking they might be able to do. So what have they put forward to try and help them do that? What's their contribution? This is really briefly 2 of the main assessments of those national pledges. One done by the United Nations Environment Program, one done by the United Nations Climate Treaty Secretariat, sort of the body in Bonn, Germany, that takes care of all the technical stuff, does analysis, arranges the meetings, all that. And both of them did separate analyses they took all these pledges, they added them up, they said, okay, what are emissions going to be? And the news wasn't good. What the pledges would do, according to the UN Environmental Program, the submitted contributions, these pledges, are far from enough, and the emissions gap in both 2025 and 2030 will be very significant. The gap between where emissions will be if countries do manage to satisfy their own pledges and where they would need to be if we were to try and hold warming below 2 degrees. What the United Nations Framework Convention Climate Change Secretariat found was that if we want to keep warming below 2 degrees, there's a certain budget, a carbon budget, that we really shouldn't go beyond. There's a certain amount of carbon that we can emit to the atmosphere, about 1,000 billion tons. Half of that available 2-degree budget would be used by 2025. 3/4 of that budget would be used by 2030, and emissions would still be rising, meaning the remainder of the budget would be used within 5 years or so. So what both of these very, respectable organizations have said is that and the Climate Change Secretariat, of course, they were touting the huge achievement that Paris was, but they also had to accept the fact, had to acknowledge the fact that the pledges that are the flesh of the agreement, they're not there yet. So what this tells us is that going forward, the whole challenge is to ratchet these pledges up. get countries to do even more than they've pledged, get them to put in new pledges that are even stronger. And so one of the really important things to try and understand if countries are going to decide they want to put forward stronger pledges, do more, contribute more, invest more, undergo more technological transformation, is to think about how a global commons problem like climate change works. What does it mean to have a global problem to which we're all contributors? So the first thing to realize is that no single country can protect its own climate by reducing its own emissions. Right? We could have our emissions plummet to zero, and it's the emissions of all the other countries that will just continue to cause climate change. And therefore, no country can solve climate change by itself. And what that means is that countries that are interested in solving their climate really have to persuade other countries to help it solve its problem, its climate problem. I won't be able to protect my climate unless I persuade all the other countries to reduce their emissions. And so what that means is that when a country reduces its own emissions, or cooperates in other ways, technologically, financially, it's doing that for the sake of inducing reciprocal effort. In other words, getting other countries to do likewise. And then this is the key point. A country is going to be successful in convincing other countries to really chip in only if they're being seen as doing their fair share. Otherwise, the other countries will say, well, I'm just going to focus on food security in my country. I'm just going to focus on building seawalls. I'm not going to focus on reducing my emissions, which by and large is for the purpose of helping the other countries. They're not even doing their fair share. And so that's precisely why fairness, why equity is such a key thing in the climate problem specifically, but any global commons problem. So international cooperation with equitable effort sharing is more likely to be agreed and successfully implemented. And this was one of the key points in the summary for policymakers of the last assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Outcomes seen as equitable can lead to more effective cooperation. That's the typical understated, staid language of the IPCC. To be effective, it's got to be fair. So a group of civil society organizations, a group of NGOs came together and said, okay, we have this United Nations Environment Program assessment of the pledges. We have this assessment from the UNFCCC Secretariat. What we don't have is country-by-country assessment of pledges to see who's doing their fair share. Who are the leaders and who are the laggards? Where does political pressure have to be applied? And it was a fairly large and diverse coalition of groups that came together. In fact, it was a larger and more diverse coalition, especially once all the names of the organizations that endorsed the results came on, than really had come together before. Organizations from the north, organizations from the south, those that had been historically focused on environment, some that had been many who had been focused on development, trade unions, peasant groups, the faith community came together in this huge coalition to say, what can we say about the fairness of the pledges? And how can we figure out where countries really need to step forward? Who are the leaders? Who are the laggards? So the place to start in trying to come up, think of something as complex as fairness and all the ethical things that it entails is with kind of the techniques, the science of the problem. Emissions are rising and rising and rising and rising, and what we need to do more or less immediately is to start to reduce emissions. And so there's a large amount of reductions, mitigation, greenhouse gas mitigation that needs to happen. In 2030, that's maybe half of emissions need to be reduced. We need to do stuff to get rid of them. Maybe about 35 billion tons or so need to be reduced. And so the question is, who does that? What countries do how much of that? What country take on what portion of that total effort that needs to be done? And so what these groups did was they started with basic underlying equity principles. They related them to quantitative indicators, indicators from standard databases like the World Development Indicators of the World Bank and World Health Organization population projections and such. And from that, they went to fair shares. What would be national fair shares of that total effort that needs to be done? And my involvement as an SEI researcher was providing technical support and doing a lot of the analysis and helping lay out the framework for how this would be done in collaboration with some other analysts who together formed the Climate Equity Reference Project. And now, since we had such a large range of groups who hadn't really worked together and sometimes had worked at cross purposes, there was a bit of disappointment at first that they couldn't actually come to a consensus on what equity meant. And if these environmental groups and development groups focused on solving this problem couldn't come to a consensus, there was some concern that, well, maybe this just can't be done. But this actually was not a bad thing, because that's just reality. People have different perspectives on what fairness is and what equity is. And so what they ended up with was sort of an equity band, a range of shares, fair shares for each country that could be kind of linked directly to the underlying ethical principles and considered fair. There are reasonable people can disagree, but they would disagree within a fairly well-bounded band, is what they found. And so they started from the equity principles as defined in the Framework Convention itself. The sort of probably the most quoted article from the Framework Convention is the Principles article. It says that parties should protect the climate system for the benefit of present and future generations of humankind on the basis of equity and in accordance with their common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. And lots of scholarship has been done on trying to disentangle what exactly that means, and lots of negotiators have come forward, putting forward their own country's view of what that means. But actually, probably the best brief, simple, layperson's encapsulation of what that really means is by Al Gore in an op-ed in the New York Times several years ago. Countries will be asked to meet different requirements based on their historical share of the contribution to their problem, their responsibility for causing the problem, and their relative ability to carry the burden of change, their capabilities for helping with a solution. This precedent is well established in international law, and there's no other way. Not only is it well established in international law, but that's basically how we do laws domestically, too. If you make a mess, if you're responsible for a mess, you help clean it up. And when it comes to, say, taxation, people contribute in accordance with their capability. We have progressive taxation in this country and almost every country in the world. You contribute, the more you have, the more you contribute. So those are the two fundamental underlying ethical principles that have kind of been with us not just since the beginning of the Framework Convention in 1992, but through the beginning of creation of laws around things around problems that need to be solved and global and common goods that need to be preserved. So I'm going to say a little bit more about responsibility and capability and what they really mean, and how this group, reflecting much of what people have thought about this in the past, decided to interpret those two. So responsibility and a country's contribution to the problem. This is from the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report, and it shows, in terms of large aggregate regions, rising greenhouse gas emissions. So things frittered along while it was a fairly small number of countries who were undergoing the Industrial Revolution and starting to develop and burning more coal and oil and gas. And then as populations grew and economies grew and developing countries really started to develop, emissions started to go up much higher. And so the question is, what should count as a country's responsibility for causing the problem? Should it be emissions, their contribution to emissions all the way back to when they were first burning fossil fuels and deforesting? Or is there sort of an amnesty period, and really they shouldn't be responsible for emissions from several generations ago? And this issue of historic responsibility is one of the most contentious and often discussed issue in the climate negotiations. And so they decide to take a few benchmarks and think about what they would mean if they only went back in time and counted a country's emissions back to a certain point. If they went back, like way back to the point where the Industrial Revolution really was kicking into gear, that would include about 95% of emissions that have. That would be a pretty comprehensive interpretation of a country's historic responsibility and their contribution to the problem. If they went back to 1950, so that's a point where many of the emissions that were being made were for people who are still alive now. Many of the emissions were for the sake of creating infrastructure that we're still benefiting from today. So the argument was made that 1950 wouldn't be an unreasonable date, and that would cover actually about 2/3 of emissions. You'd be providing amnesty for about 1/3. 1990 is a date that often comes up, and it's set as the date when the negotiations for a climate treaty began in earnest. People really started to understand that there was a climate problem. It would include, if you only looked at emissions back to 1990, about 1/3 of emissions. Now, what this group of organizations said was that it probably doesn't make sense to go back further than 1850. It doesn't seem fair to cut off emissions before 1950. We're still actually benefiting from emissions that were made then. And so we're going to take a range of possible definitions for historic responsibility, ranging from going all the way back to 1850 to 1950. Because of the fact that 1990 was the start of the negotiations, and many people have raised that as an appropriate point to start talking about historical emissions, they said, you know what, we're going to look at 1990 just to see what the impacts would be as far as what they would imply for defining fair shares. We don't think it's part of a reasonable equity band, but just as kind of a political marker, we want to look at that too. So after these discussions, what they came up with was a particular range for defining historic responsibility, and then also a separate political marker. Now, going on to talk about capability. There are lots of ways to think about a country's capability in solving the climate problem, technological capability and financial capability and their political wherewithal. But there's one indicator that correlates very, very strongly with any of these other possible indicators of a country's ability to help solve the problem, and that's income. Almost all of these things are so strongly correlated with income. What you have here are 3 income distribution charts to help us think about what does income mean in the context of capability and helping to solve the problem. A chart for India, a chart for China, and a chart for US. An income distribution chart is what you would get if you lined up everyone in the country from the poorest on the left to the wealthiest on the right and plotted their income. And this is plotted in purchasing power parity terms, meaning the actual purchasing power. Costs are less in India or in China than in the United States, so purchasing power is actually higher. So this reflects the fact that you get more out of a dollar in India or in China than in the US. And there are two particular kind of points marked out on here, something called a development threshold, which is a level of income that, according to some pretty interesting empirical research that looks across countries and across times, suggests this is a level of income above which people are really starting to engage in kind of, sort of middle-class consumer lifestyles, and below which they're still at the point of trying to deal with some basic plagues of poverty, like malnutrition and lack of access to health care and lack of access to education and high infant mortality and low life expectancy. And it's at about $20 a day where there's kind of a bend in the curve, and those indicators start to take on developed country values. There's another line on here, this luxury threshold. And a lot of discussions were had about where that should be and what's the right way to define it. But it's a level that some research has shown beyond which those indicators don't improve at all. And even subjective indicators of happiness of well-being don't tend to improve either. And so beyond that level of income, $30,000 a year or so, per person, these are all per person per year, one can think of one's income as certainly being more available to help solve this global problem than income below this development threshold, which one might think about as not being available, as income that really should go toward meeting these fundamental basic needs of the poor. And so this is kind of a framework that this group used to think about progressivity in defining a country's capacity. Just like in our own tax system, there's a certain level of income below which we don't tax income. And as income rises, it gets progressively taxed more and more heavily. That's how they wanted to think about income. They thought looking at average national incomes was really misleading. There are wealthy people in all countries. The numbers are smaller in some countries than others, but that curve, there are some billionaires in India. And, you know, the last few people on that curve are richer than the vast majority of people in the United States. And this should be taken into account. And thankfully, there are databases that the World Income Inequality Database tells us a lot about distributions of income and wealth. And so what they said is, let's think of this in terms of a progressive tax system, where people who are really below this development threshold don't have to contribute. They contribute nothing to their country's capability. People above it contribute at a higher level. And progressively, people contribute more. So it's a way of thinking about capability based on the simplest indicator you can think of, income, but which takes into account how we ethically tend to think about people's capability in a progressive way, in a way like progressive taxation system. So one can think about it in more progressive or less progressive ways, but they came up with a particular range again, a higher progressivity and medium progressivity way of thinking about it. And they said, okay, let's see what this implies. And here's a set of key countries, kind of key and representative countries, but the analysis we did was for all countries, showing some basic indicators like their contribution, their share of world population, their income per capita in purchasing power parity terms, and then their responsibility and their capability, meaning their share of global emissions since, in the case of this table and these numbers, 1850. That country's share of global emissions since 1850. And you see the US has a pretty large share, 43%. EU, only half that. China, non-trivial, 4%, but quite small compared to their population, more than a sixth of the world's population. India, actually truly a trivial contribution compared to their population. And then capability is their share of the total income above that development threshold, that $20 a day development threshold, and then considered in a progressive way above that. And again, the U.S., quite a large share of income above that threshold. European Union less. China, interestingly, a larger share of capability, defined that way, than of responsibility, a larger share of the ability to solve the problem than their contribution to causing it. India, again, fairly negligible. The least developed countries overall, about 1 billion people, truly negligible. And then these terms, Annex 1 and non-Annex 1, refer to, that's kind of the UN lingo for developed countries and developing countries. So developed countries as a whole, about 4/5 of the total responsibility and also capability, and developing countries about 1/5. So the next step was just to do the simplest thing you could imagine with these two indicators, indicator of responsibility and capability, which is take the average and say, okay, that's your combined responsibility capability indicator of your country. That's your share of the global responsibility and capability, and how much you should contribute to solving this problem. In general, these responsibility and capability numbers are so similar that the average kind of just like straddles between them. And so we end up with the US with some 40%, the EU with about half that, China with about 5%, India almost nothing. Developed countries as a whole, where developed means North America, Western Europe, Japan, Australia, New Zealand. And so one thing that is really important is that things are changing. China's, economic growth has been phenomenal, and its emissions have been rising. And so that over time, these shares will change. In 2030, for example, the United States' share will have dropped to a bit less than in 2015. China's share will have increased quite significantly. It will have doubled because of its growing economy. And as I mentioned, this group wanted to look at a band, an equity band, a range of possible fair shares of the total. So a band based on that sort of more forgiving definition of historic responsibility, ignore everything before 1950, and a less progressive definition of capability gives you somewhat different numbers. The United States share drops to about a quarter of the total combined responsibility and capability. And China's raises to, say, 20. And then, as I mentioned, there is this other, not within their equity band, but this other political benchmark that they wanted to consider, 1990, and barely progressive at all. And that would bring the United States share down even further to about a fifth, China up to about 16%, and others shifting accordingly. So what we have here, I mean, in a sense, this is the end of the equity part of the analysis. A sort of ruthless exercise of going from very complex ethical principles to robust, well-known, well-vetted quantitative indicators to actual fair shares, national fair shares, how much each country should do to help solve the problem. It's ruthless in the sense that it makes massive simplifications, as it must do when trying to go from something as complex as and the ethical tangle that climate change is, to numbers that reflect how much countries should do. But one thing that's really interesting about this is that even if you take a fairly wide kind of spectrum view of what is fair, ignore most of historical emissions or consider most of historical emissions, be fairly progressive or almost ignore progressivity, you get numbers that span a range, from 21% in the marker that they didn't even consider to be really equitable, to 37% of the total should be done by the United States. So it was an interesting exercise in that it took fairly varied opinions, but put them on a common footing so they could all come up with numbers, fair shares for countries that could be compared. So what do we do with this? You'll remember on the earlier graph, I showed the amount of emissions reduction that need to happen. It was some 35 gigatons of reductions need to happen by 2030. Well, we can interpret these as the portion of that reduction, that 35 gigaton reduction that each country should do. And so that's what this is. It's a comparison between what countries should do, according to that conception of what's fair, and what they've actually pledged to do. So the pledges are these dark horizontal lines. The United States has pledged to do about 2,000 million metric tons, 2 gigatons of reductions by 2030. There are two lines there because the way that the U.S. presented its pledge was we'll reduce by something like between 26 and 28% below our 2005 emissions. So that's its pledge. That equates to about 2 gigatons of reductions. The EU is a little bit less than that. Interestingly, China's pledge was quite a bit more than that. They also had a range, and it ranged from about 5 billion tons to a bit more than 6 billion tons. So the black horizontal lines are the actual pledges. The green lines, the green bars, are the fair shares. How much those countries would do if they were doing their fair share of that some 35 gigatons of reductions. So the United States, which on the other chart was something around a third, you can look at that. So between their equity range was between 37 and 27%, being a quarter and a third of 35 gigatons gives you, somewhere in the 9 to 13 gigatons of reductions range. That's what the United States would be doing if it was doing its fair share according to this conception of this somewhat broad conception of what's fair. That third political marker that wasn't very progressive and ignored most of historical emissions would have the United States doing about 7 gigatons. So this is how we can compare this sort of simple framework for thinking about fair shares to the actual pledges that have been put on the table. And so we see some quite clear things jump out at us. One is that there are some countries that have pledged to do much less than their fair share would suggest they would do. They've pledged to do much less than even what the not really that fair conception of what their fair share would suggest they should do. The United States, the European Union, China, interestingly, has actually pledged to do more than its fair share. It's pledged to contribute more to solving the climate problem, despite sort of the news and despite how we hear China talked about. But they're shutting down coal mines. They have a coal mine moratorium. They're shutting down power plants. They're actually doing a lot that's reducing emissions below what it would be if they were just continuing to rely on fossil fuels for their development. They're also investing a tremendous amount in solar and wind and have been credited almost wholly with the massive reduction in solar panel costs that's happened over the last 6 years or so. Japan, similarly, much less than its fair share. Brazil kind of hitting its fair share, getting up there. Russia's pledge was basically to do nothing. They gave a pledge that gave an emissions level that was much higher than anyone even would project it would possibly be getting to, even if it was developing, growing its economy at just astronomical rates. India also more than its fair share. Indonesia more than its fair share. Kenya and Marshall Islands almost impossible to see there, but also more than their fair share. So obviously, this does give us a sense of who are the leaders and who are the laggards. We could have broadened the spectrum here more. We could have ignored all of historical emissions. We could have made other assumptions, and it wouldn't have changed these results that much, which was the precise value of actually ending up doing this collaboration among a bunch of groups who couldn't agree on what fairness was. If there was one line on here and we're comparing them and we were seeing that, oh, these pledges aren't meeting these fair shares, you'd say, yeah, but what if you change the fair shares? But now, even using a broad range of views of what's fairness, we see who the leaders are and who the laggards are. There's another really interesting thing to point out about this, which is that, okay, so say the United States were to do its fair share. Say it was to do 8 to 12, 13 billion tons of reductions in 2030. How would it do that? U.S. emissions are about 5 billion tons. So it couldn't do 8 to 13 billion tons of reductions if the emissions are only 5. And similarly, even with China, it could do, 3, 4 domestically. But the amount of reductions that would need to happen in China or in India is actually much more than that. If we're to keep within that 2-degree budget of 1,000 gigatons, if we're really to be on a 2-degree pathway, a lot more has to happen in these poor countries than would really be their fair share to do. And if we're to do it in a fair way, a lot more would have to be done by these wealthy countries than they're capable of doing domestically. So that's sort of a fundamental challenge of the climate problem. You have some countries that have a lot more ethical obligation to help solve the problem than they have domestically the ability to do. And you have other countries that have a lot less ethical obligation to help solve the problem, but that's where the action has to happen. That's sort of the fundamental conundrum of the climate problem. And the only way to square that circle is through international cooperation. Is to have the wealthy countries who have the finance and who have the technology to be helping the poor countries to actually undertake the mitigation, to actually undertake the emission reduction, above and beyond what would even be their own fair share, those countries' own fair share to undertake. The solution to solving the climate problem is cooperation, international cooperation. And if we just think of it in terms of, yeah, we'll reduce our own emissions, it won't be possible to solve the problem. It would be relying on some countries doing much less than would really be their fair share, and some countries doing much more. And it's not possible to have an international agreement hold that is based on that disparity. So I'm going to skip that, and I'm going to wrap it up. So in conclusion, the recent pledge assessments, whether it's the UN Environment Program or the Climate Change Secretariat or the Civil Society Equity Review, all concur that we're not on track. The pledges on which the Paris Agreement is based, they don't solve the climate problem, right? 75% of the total budget would be burned in just the next 15 years. Countries will need to ratchet up their effort further than their pledges have suggested they're so far willing to do. And equity is key if this is to happen. As the IPCC said, a fair agreement is more likely to actually be a successful agreement. Assessing the Paris pledges on the basis of equity does provide some clear lessons. Even when you think of it in a range, even though you accept the fact that equity has kind of fundamental normative components that people aren't ever going to totally agree on, we still can learn that some nations are unambiguously leaders and some are unambiguously laggards. And for wealthier countries, providing support is a core part of fulfilling their fair share of the effort. Without that support, they just wouldn't be able to fulfill their fair share. They couldn't do that much emission reductions domestically. And for poorer countries, even those who have met their own fair share, much more emissions reduction must be done in their countries with support through international cooperation. So that was the lessons, and not unsurprising lessons, that came out of this Civil Society Equity Review. What will happen in 2 years, in 2018, is the next big follow-up to the Paris meeting. And at that meeting, there's going to be a sort of concerted dialogue around these pledges and ratcheting them up. So between now and then, a lot of work is being done within individual countries by supportive decision makers and policymakers, but also by civil society organizations to try and kind of build a domestic politics that will enable more ambitious pledges to be put forward, so that in 2018 there's another round of pledges. People say, okay, we've been through our first round of negotiations, and now let's see. Now we're willing to come forward with something stronger. And so increasingly what the question is going to be is, do I see my negotiating partners coming forward with what I see to be a fair share? And that, I think, will determine whether we actually manage to stay closer to being on track with a 2-degree pathway. Thanks. We have time for questions? Okay, great.
Thank you, Sivan. That was great.
Okay, you've seen this so many times that you probably have a question that you've been pondering for months.
Or years even.
Years even.
So already a long time ago you mentioned about this inequality within countries.
Yes.
Of wealthy and poor. So how does that, I didn't quite see how that fits into the calculations though. So I'm curious about that part.
Okay.
And the other part is wealthy countries to finance other countries to do more. Mm-hmm. Has there been further discussion about where that money would come from?
Okay.
Specifically within a country, is that part of a development budget or part of a tax system on carbon emissions, or have there been recommendations on that?
Okay, great questions. As far as the inequality, so the fact that we sort of opened the box and looked within countries and actually talked about income distributions and who are the elites and who are the poor, it was pretty unsettling for a lot of people. I mean, people are used to thinking of this as an international negotiation between national parties, and what happens within the country stays within the country. So it was pretty unsettling, and it does have implications. So one thing it means is that since we're not just looking at average per capita income across the country, it means that we do actually look at data that identifies the income or the wealth of the elites. And that contributes to the calculation of a country's capacities. Countries with an average income below that $20 a day, if you're just looking at average income, wouldn't have any obligation to contribute on the basis of capacity. But when you unpack that box and identify the income owned by the highest income classes, the income earned by the highest income classes, then you do see that they have some capacity. So what it means is that the more unequal a country is, the more they're gauged to actually have capacity to contribute, because a higher proportion of their income isn't going to just meeting basic needs, but is going toward consumer class or even elite class consumption. And then as far as where the money would come from, it's a very country-specific thing. So one thing that's being talked about all over, in fact, G20, the G20 meeting, most recent G20 meeting made a big deal of it, was fossil fuel subsidy reform. So environmental tax shifting, where taxes that are currently being put into things that are sort of environmentally perverse, like fossil fuel subsidies, shifting that to environmental causes, or part of it to environmental causes and part of it to income tax reductions. There's been more and more discussion about kind of what's referred to as innovative finance, which is especially in this time of austerity, where the EU in particular, they're not interested in putting more things into their own welfare system, so nothing of sort of a global welfare. There's more and more discussion of basically, in the International Monetary Fund, they have names for it like special drawing rights and such, but it's basically printing money. We need to, if we can't solve this now, it's better to borrow from the future in terms of borrowing financially with green bonds, than it is to borrow from the future in the sense of letting the environment go to trash and letting them figure out how to pick up the pieces and deal with it. So there are various different ways, but all that said, that's the biggest challenge. Countries are uninterested in investing money in something that isn't seen to be their immediate number one priority, like whether it's defense or terrorism or so. But that is that's a key problem.
Hi. So I guess just as a follow-up to that question, I understand that, I like the theory of looking at these countries and their income distribution and seeing which have people who have money to spare, as opposed to just average income level. But it just seems to me that even if there are a few billionaires, these are not the people that are going to be, having the cost burden of lowering emissions. Like you were talking about how China, for example, has coal factories that have been shut down, and it just seems so unlikely to me that the people who are suffering from these coal factories being shut down are the few people whose income is above that luxury level.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. That the domestic politics is such a huge part of it, and one of the purposes, I think, of this civil society group wanting to focus on domestic inequalities is that it's necessary to draw attention to those domestic inequalities, and it's necessary to come up with paths forward that are low emissions on the one hand, but also recognize those inequalities. So one of the biggest sticking points so far, one of the biggest difficulties with trying to deal with climate change anywhere is exactly this issue of livelihoods, and that the fossil fuel industry is a fundamental core industry of so many economies, and there are a lot of jobs in it. Interestingly, jobs have been declining steadily over decades and are a fraction of what they used to be because of mechanization, not because of environmental load, but because of mechanization. But still, the issue of those jobs and the need to find a just transition for those, for coal miners or oil rig workers or whoever, I would claim is absolutely essential part of coming up with a low carbon path forward. The low carbon path forward is definitely not just about what are the right technologies and how do you get a smart grid and that kind of thing. The low carbon path forward is definitely also a question of what does a just transition look like for people whose livelihoods currently depend on an unsustainable system.
How realistic do you think is the time frame given the inertia of the current system and the jobs that depend on this?
I think the best indicator of how realistic it is what countries put forward in Paris as what they thought they could realistically contribute, which was not nearly as much as what was needed. And so my answer would be that as politics is now, it's not realistic that we'll solve this problem, and that politics has to change. People have to become, this has to be seen as a more salient and urgent problem, and the ways of solving it have to be seen in more expansive way that brings in issues like equity and livelihoods. But I think, as sort of grim as that sounds, it's not politically realistic. The precipitous changes in what is politically realistic that have happened in the past, whether it was with 9/11 or, freedoms that people gave up with the Patriot Act, the precipitous changes in what political realism is, give me hope that this can happen. I don't think the science is going to change. We're not going to suddenly find out that it's less of a problem. So I think that building concern about the problem and mobilizing a desire, political pressure internally in countries to have decision makers actually do something about it, I think that's the only route to solving the problem, because that's the way to change what's politically realistic.
Thank you for a great presentation. When I think of the Stockholm Institute, I think of the concept of virtual water. And I'm curious, in looking at your equity charts, if there isn't a virtual carbon dioxide problem that's getting missed here. When I think of carbon dioxide release in China, I know that one of the things that's going on that's driving a lot of industry in China is production for the U.S. And for Western nations, and it's true for other developing countries as well. And my concern is, are we missing a chunk of essentially virtual carbon dioxide in that equity chart that really belongs at the top of the stack for what the U.S. owes as its fair share, and doesn't belong in the developing countries that are producing things for the U.S. market?
That's a fantastic question. And there's been more and more about what's called the emissions embodied in trade, which is the carbon analog of virtual water. And now there are data sets available looking at trade-related emissions and trade-related sectors. And not surprisingly, and we've done this analysis, if you think about a country's responsibility, not in terms of its territorial emissions, what's coming from its own geographic area, but in terms of consumption-based accounting, then not surprisingly, you find that it's wealthier countries whose responsibility would be even higher and developing countries lower, by and large, and then there are some exceptions. It turns out that for the least developed countries, where almost no manufacturing happens there, but whatever they purchase is imported, domestic emissions will be higher. But for the most part, and for larger countries, in the U.S. and for China and for India and for Europe, their responsibility will go up if you look at it from a consumption-based counting standpoint. For China specifically, its emissions associated with exported goods is something on the order of 15% of its total. So you could, in rough terms, it would reduce their share of the responsibility by something on the order of 15%.
Okay, one last question.
You alluded to the fact that one of the main impediments to the achievement of ambitious legislation that would adequately mitigate greenhouse gas emissions to meet the 2 degrees Celsius threshold was a lot of political intransigence, and now that we need to exert greater political pressure on policymakers to properly address this issue. My question is, what do you see as the main impediments to achieving these objectives, and how do you think that institutions or social groups can adequately exert greater pressure on politicians?
Okay, really, really good questions, and very complex questions, and I don't know the answers, but I have two thoughts on it. One is related to the other question, that I think that there really are some fundamental domestic equity issues that need to become part of the green agenda, the environmental agenda. You know, up to now, environmental groups haven't really been that concerned about coal miners, you know, other people who depend on sort of fossil livelihoods. And I think that has to be embraced. There is a so-called blue-green movement. There's a coalition that has formed between trade unions and environmental groups, but it's not a very dominant concern in the environmental movement. And I think livelihoods have to become a dominant concern in the environmental movement. The other thing is that it's not, the intransigence certainly isn't just coming from poor coal miners. The intransigence is also coming from coal company shareholders and, you know, people whose livelihoods, they'll probably land on their feet if there's a low carbon transition. And there is a lot of power wielded within the political system that's being wielded by fossil fuel interests, and they I think have been very strong in determining what domestic climate policy looks like, not just in this country, but in many countries. I think that they've been very effective at sort of muddying the message. People still think of as climate as, in many ways, kind of a political thing, and, you know, the jury is still out on whether it's really happening, and some of the media is, you know, pretty pathetic on how it reports on climate change, and so I think that to be honest, a more democratic and responsive political process that was less sensitive to money interests would go a long way toward helping us have more rational climate policy.
Well, thank you, Shivan, one more time. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you.
There's a token for
Oh,
thank you. This is
why,
for
thank you.
And if you are interested in being on our mailing list, you can sign up on your way out. It's either to get our Environmental Weekly, where it gives you updates of what jobs are out there and opportunities, or finding out what's happening at Lunch and Learn. So if you haven't signed up and you're interested in being on the list, please sign up. Thank you so much for coming.